So hello everybody, welcome to today's talk, Farming in Gloucestershire, and the alternative title is that one, and if anybody reads Viz Comics, that's Farmer Parma, who's quite an entertaining character. But we start off with, and really, this is basically our trifold division of Gloucestershire landscapes. Forest Vale and High Blue Hill, as the poets have said, that's the single biggest influence on farming in Gloucestershire. So what we're going to be doing, we're going to be looking all around this, and we've got lots of images and documents here to show you. Obviously, we can't do everything. It's just going to be such a big subject. But we'll start off with this one, and I like to start really in the prehistory period. So we know modern humans first visited this region before the last ice age around 40,000 years ago. First permanent hunter-gatherers really didn't arrive till about 8,000 years ago. And at this time, the landscape mostly consisted of what's being termed the wildwood, which is a vast, mostly unbroken canopy forest of alder, hazel, lime, oak, elm, holly, blackthorn, and hawthorn. Trees are all familiar with today. And of course, there were lots and lots of animal residents. So these are sort of what you might loosely call the good guys, I suppose. So beaver, wild boar, red deer. There were no fallow deer at this time. And the picture from the cave painting at Lascaux is of the Boss All Rocks, the giant wild cattle. Of course, there are also ones that weren't quite so welcoming. So we have a lovely set of wolves, lynxes, and bears. So all these animals were there around when the first humans sort of came along. We'll move straight into the Roman period because this is when farming really gets going from our point of view. So the Roman period set the pattern for agriculture that still works today, and it's based on an organized economy with the countryside producing food for urban markets. So in Gloucestershire, the main ones are Gloucester and Cirencester, and the urban markets providing goods, tools and sykes for the countryside. So basically they worked in harmony with each other. And again, as always, thank you for the wonderful Phil Moss for allowing me to use these drawings that he's made. It's also thought the Romans brought the Cotswold sheep breed in, or at least they brought their own long-wooled sheep from the continent, and they bred with local Iron Age sheep to produce the Cotswold sheep. We'll look at that a little bit later on. Now, medieval Gloucestershire, here we get place names becoming common, named after the inhabitant or owner or the place's physical characteristics. So Withington, for example, Widandium, Whittier's Dun or Hill Pasture. Some are more simple, Bishop's Cleeve. This is the cliff bank or steep hill belonging to the bishop, the bottom of Cleeve Hill there. King Stanley, the King Stony Woodland Clearing. So some names are quite straightforward. Also named after types of livestock, trees or growing crops. And in who got a selection here, Caroli does mean cows, flaxleaf is flax, etc., etc. So there's lots of these places, and this is where you sort of really get farming taking off in this county. Quick look at the Domesday Books. It's very useful. It's obviously William's great survey to find out who held what land, its value, and what taxes had been paid to previous Saxon kings. It's excellent if you've not looked at it. It records landowners, tenants, the amount of land they owned, how many people occupied the land, their class, the amounts of woodland, meadowland, number of animals, ploughs on the land, etc., etc. It also gives a rather interesting population breakdown at the time, which was 14% nobility, 12% freemen, 60% serfs and cotters, and also 9% slaves. There was still quite a large slave owning economy at the time. And to find out what it can tell you, this is the entry for Cheltenham. Terra Regis, land of the king, basically there. What looks like the red stripe through there is actually their underlining. For some reason, they put it higher up than we do. But if you look at that, you can see, there's various, you can make out some Latin numbers. There's a couple of words. You can probably see Melini is one, meaning mill. And if you translate this, and there are very many really good translations about now, you get to this. So, it's quite an amazing piece of work. Edward held Chittingham, Cheltenham, 8 hides and a half, 1 hide and a half belongs to church. What I find interesting the number of plough teams that there's recorded here. So 3 plough teams, there's 18. There's lots there. You get lots of information in this. Also, it's I like this last one at the very end. It's in the time of King Edward. The manor paid £9, 5 shillings, and 3,000 loaves of bread for the dogs. Dogs are often fed on bread at this time. And then it says now it pays £20, 20 cows, 20 hogs, and 16 shillings instead of the loaves. What I find fascinating, even if you think of the size of a loaf of bread back then, is going to be a lot smaller. 3,000 is an awful lot of bread. So it's an awful lot of wheat they've got to grow. So it tells you some of the really interesting information. So a quick look at the medieval farming year. So there you go. This is the literal Psalter. It's excellent, but if you've not seen it, I recommend you have a look at it. So top left, you have ploughing. This is a 4-oxen team here, led by 2 people. Next slide down on the left-hand side, that is harrowing. And notice the crows there nicking some of the seeds. We'll look at that a little bit later. Then you've got below broadcasting the seed. I think these two are a bit misaligned, I think they should be the other way around, but they don't appear to be. And then top right, you've got harvesting. Notice the ladies are harvesting the corn with sickles rather than scythes. And you've got the men packing up the stooks of corn. And then at the bottom right, you've got threshing the corn there. You can tell this is hot, arduous work because the men there are in their underpants, basically. These are medieval braids they're wearing. So they've taken off the hose and they're actually trying to cool down. So a quick look at the medieval rural forest. So forest as a land classification had been introduced in late Saxon times, but under the Norman rule, the forest largely became royal forest, which were places reserved for the king or those with permission to hunt. And you can argue that the Normans can arguably be called the first environmentalists, as they introduced new laws to protect the venison, which was the animals, so red deer, fallow deer, roe and wild boar, and the vert, which was the vegetation that supported these. And they realised that if you sort of got rid of the vert, you're not going to get the venison. And this is a wonderful photograph from the Boring Truth, which is an excellent website dedicated to wild boar in the UK, which shows not only shows a sounder of boar crossing the road, but in the background you've got a couple of fallow deer as well. A great photograph, and I thoroughly recommend you visit the website. Lots of information on the boar. So forest wasn't just woodland, but typically included heath, grassland and wetlands. And land designated as forest, chase or warren land was officially exempted from common law and was only subject to the authority of the king. And this included any villages within the area. So it made life a lot tougher. The Normans actually created 21 forests in England. 7 of them, so fully a third, were in Gloucestershire. So we've got Alveston, Braden, Course Forest, Horwood Forest, Kingswood, Michaelwood, or Micklewood as it is known, and the Forest of Dean. So, we know Gloucestershire was quite an important area for them, and especially for the hunting. Reason we talk about the forest, basically we have the lovely rural forest of Dean on our doorstep. So these were administered by a vast array of officials with great names: verderers, agisters, foresters and fee. These were the officials. They were backed up by quite a complex system of assemblies and courts. You had things called swanny-moots, inquests, regards, which were held every 3 years in an inquiry. This is why the Forest of Dean Local History Society's journal is called the New Regard. And there was also heirs, punishment courts. So, all these things worked in tandem to protect the forest. And we know Forest of Dean was initially administered from St Brabble's Castle, which was also a major centre for manufacturing arrows and quarrels for crossbows. And of these officials, I guess the most important ones are the verderers. These investigated and recorded offences such as the taking of venison, illegal cutting of woodland, and they also dealt with the day-to-day forest administration. Originally, they held their court at Kensley House, which has been replaced by a new house there. But in 1676, they moved to the more famous Speech House, and where they still meet today. So you can still go to the Speech House and look at the verderer's courtroom, and it's quite good to do. Quick mention a little bit about hunting. This was basically the raison d'etre for most of the forests. Generally took place with men on horseback, supported by hunt followers with hounds, and different dogs were employed in different things. So you'd have, for example, limers would smell deer, and then you'd have the actual hounds would chase the deer down. And there's a couple of manuscript pictures here of hunting boar and hunting deer. Various weapons used: sword spears, boar spears, crossbows, and bows. Quite a bloody thing to do, I think, but that's what the Normans loved the best. And it's at this sort of period where we get the first named farm, although it doesn't actually get recorded until the mid 1500s. And this is the document in the archives that it's on. It's named as Brigsbury Farm, and it was granted by letters patent of Edward VI to Sir Anthony Kingston, who was the Provost Marshal and High Sheriff of Gloucestershire, in September 1552. And originally, this farm was a possession of Cirencester Abbey and had passed into the Crown's hands at the dissolution. It was one that Henry didn't sell off, but his son Edward VI did instead. So this is our first named farm in Gloucestershire, and of course we've got thousands more today. Quick look at what a manor was. So a manor was a method of land ownership or tenure during the Middle Ages and later. A manor size could vary enormously. Typically, it would include a manor house, which was the home of the lord and his dependents. Then it was attached to a rural estate with a population of labourers or serfs who worked the land to support the lord, but in return they received certain rights and privileges, which meant they could stay there. Manors maintained written records that included court rolls and surveys, maps, terriers, documents in relation to the boundaries, wastes, customs, or courts of the manor. And I guess the two most famous ones are the court baron. These would deal with customs of the manor and offences against it. And then you had the court leets, which enforcement of law and order within the manor. And again, these can be scattered all over the place. We hold a fair number here in the archives, various places. This is a page of the manor at King's Own, for example. Here's another couple. The one thing you might notice straight away is that the language isn't in English. Basically, until the sort of 1700s, most manorial documents were recorded in Latin, so that can be a bit of a stumbling block. But the National Archives has got a list of surviving manors and where their records are held, so that's also worth looking at if you're interested in researching the history of a particular manor. And I should also say that the VCH, the Victoria County History of Gloucestershire, has excellent information on manors as well. Quick enclosure. Prior to the mid 1700s, farming was run on an open field basis. This is where all the arable land in a parish or a manor was divided into long, narrow strips for cultivation. An individual holding would consist of about 20 acres of land lying in about 70 or so strips scattered all over the manor with no two strips lined together. And basically one of the reasons this came about was it reinforced the need for cooperative farming. So the people in a parish or a manor had to work together to get the land worked and had to get the sort of grow crops and everything like that. It was real communal farming. Each strip was about a quarter of an acre in size. They were all unfenced. And this type of landscape, this cultivated landscape, came to be known as ridge and furrow. And this is a picture I took of ridge and furrow landscape near Didbrook, just below Winchcombe there. And you can see the lumps and the bumps in the land there. There was a great chap called Marshall who wrote a history of agriculture in the UK, and he actually wrote that in Gloucestershire some of these ridges were so defined that you might be 6 foot tall, but if you stood in the furrow of one, you wouldn't be able to see the ridge of the next one to it. So they obviously can get quite large depending on where you are. Some of the best places to see them are if you go up to the top Cotswold Escarpment and just look down, and you'll see when Crickley Hill, for example, go to the top of Crickley Hill, look down towards Badgeworth, and there's loads of these ridges and furrows. You can see them quite easily. So small-scale enclosure had been going on since the medieval period to create warrens and deer parks. This is an example of a really early enclosure. This is Homesteland, a hamlet at Todingham. That was enclosed in 1593, and on the preamble, the top left there, you can't read it. It does say the land which lay dispersed by ridges amongst the tenants, and now by consent every man's portion layered together. So this is basically where they got rid of all the ridges and furrows and divided the land up into parcels. They still had pasture. You can see the great meadow there at the top, and there is still probably some woodland kicking around here, I would think. But this was small scale enclosure. Now, the enclosure movement was on a national scale, and it was instigated by upper class landowners. Their argument was that if you enclose these open fields, you merge and redistribute the land, it reduced waste, improved efficiency, and brought agricultural advances that could increase food production. It could also increase profits, which a lot of them were looking at. And this picture comes from Bedfordshire archives. It shows a surveyor marking out an enclosure. There's a very nice little shepherd on the left hand side with his dog, looks quite happy. Little does he know what's probably going to happen to the fields he runs his sheep in. So basically, as I said, the earliest enclosures were undertaken by landowners using private parliamentary bills. But in 1773, an Act of Parliament was passed to legalise enclosure, provided a systematic process and certain conditions were observed. Allegedly, they weren't always done. Basically, the upshot: the winners of all the enclosure, big landowners, essentially the fat cats. The losers, you've guessed it, commoners and the poor, who received little or no good land and then lost most of their common law rights. So we are still suffering, I like to use that word, from the Enclosure Acts today. It's what's carved up our countryside and what's left the place. You drive through the Cotswolds, so you'll see private keep out everywhere, whereas before it wasn't. But we've got an illustration of this. So this is a lovely drawing of the pre-enclosure map of Cold Aston. They were supposed to have done pre-enclosure maps for most places that were enclosed, but they don't survive very often. This is one we have. And I'll just draw your attention to the middle section around the village. And you can see sort of like a backwards Y in shape there in the centre of the village. So this is the pre-enclosure. It's a very faded map, unfortunately, but you can see all the sort of the strips still. You can still make out all these strips scattered around the village. So this is the pre-enclosure map. This is the post-enclosure map, again centred on the village. But you can see where you had all the little strips. Now you've got big parcels of land given to various people. The poor in the previous picture had a strip in every field. In this one, they have a tiny little segment just below the village. You just might be able to make it up next to the two horizontal fields. There's a little rectangle. That is the field for the poor. So, they lost quite a lot. And no apologies for repeating this poem of the time. I love it. They hang the man and flog the woman that steals the goose from off the common. But let the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. The law demands that we atone when we take things we do not own, but leaves the lord and ladies fine who take things that are yours or mine. Isn't that wonderful? And this really was public opinion. The general population really thought that the rich people were stealing all the land, which of course in many respects they were. So it's worth bearing in mind. But there's lots of information on the enclosure movements out there, and all the troubles that it caused. Looking at tithes, so tithes are a 1/10 in-kind contribution of produce given to the church from 855 onwards. So it's a very early tax, essentially. There is two main types. You had grape tithes. These are the products of crop husbandry, i.e. the stuff that grew every year from the ground. Corn and hay were included in this. And then you had small tithes, which were the product of animal husbandry, so meat, milk, eggs, etc., but also the work of men, so fish, wheat and flour, etc. And of course, as an in-kind payment, churches had to build places to store it, typified by the tithe bond. So as at Asherworth, Hartbury and Poslip, and Hartbury is the top here, Asherworth is the bottom one. So the church had to store this because the vicar might get half a pound of corn, a couple of eggs, and maybe a leg of lamb or something like that as part of the tithe. So it wasn't the best way of sort of doing stuff. But rather like enclosure, tithes were not liked. And again, this little poem cropped up: Lord, save us from this craving priest who steals our crops and sees our beast. So again, public opinion didn't like them. By the late 1700s, however, tithes were seen as a major obstacle to agricultural improvement, especially following enclosure, and they also provoked anger and bitterness towards the Anglican Church. There's little new there, is there? And in 1836, finally, the in-kind tithes were abolished and replaced with money by the Tithe Commutation Act. This was mostly to make tithe, which were levied on churchgoers and non-churchgoers alike, easier to collect. So instead of basically half a cow and a few bags of corn, you now got money. To figure this out, they created lots of maps and schedules. Special commissioners were appointed, and these were created to sort of show how much land people had, how much they had to pay. And they've created a fantastic snapshot across the country for the 1840s, essentially. Tithes were finally abolished in 1936, primarily due to pressure from nonconformist religions, who was arguing that why should the Church of England get this money when a lot of people were nonconformists. And in an amazing outbreak of sanity, the government said, well, that's a good idea, actually. So what we'll do, instead of making people pay to the non-conformists, we'll just ban the tithes and just get rid of them, which is what they did. And there was a complex system of payments put into place. Basically, they had to account from 1936 till the end of time. So a really complicated system. There's some quite books on this, but basically the final tithe payments were not made until 1977. And the maps on the left here are basically just an extraction of the Dowdeswell tithe map. And basically what you see at the top is what you get. You get the map, you get the numbers of the fields. You also get an apportionment, which is amazing. But I love gives you field names. The bottom map is a redrawn tithe map by a chap called Jeff Watkin. He sells these from his website, and this depicts my uncle's farm up at Dowdeswell. And what I find really interesting, of all the field names there, most have remained since the 1830s, which of course means they were there earlier. There are a few that have changed, but mostly they are the same. And this is one of the beauties of the tithe. You can look at a tithe map and you can get lots of the field names, which is like a fascinating subject in their own right. Looking at pests and vermin, so by the 1500s, yes, the 1500s, population was finally recovering from the Black Death of the 1360s. But agriculture hadn't changed greatly, and a mix of a growing population but low yields meant that food was scarce and pests were a serious problem. And they have this lovely rhyme: 4 seeds in a hole, one for the rook, one for the crow, one to rot and one to grow. So basically on the face of that is basically, it means of the 4 seeds you're planting, you're only going to get 1 plant. So it's like 3/4 of your crop is gone already. And as a result, there were various enactments used to sort of deter and catch pests. This is a picture of a Tudor clap net, basically to catch pigeons. You can see their woodies there, and B clap nets. After the Tudor laws were enacted, which we'll look at in a moment, most villages had to have like 10 years of clap nets, purposely trying to catch birds to keep them down, so they don't survive in an archaeological context, which we don't really know little about them. But say to try and increase farm yields and fend off food shortages, which of course, bad food shortages meant unhappy population, rebellion. The Tudor monarchs introduced a series of acts that were designated species that were considered vermin. And the most complete one is that we'll just see in a moment. It's Elizabeth's Act for the Preservation of Grain in 1566. This included a list of the species classed as vermin and the bounty, or the amount of money that they would receive for killing them. And this is the list, and it's a terrifying one: crows, choughs, pies, rooks, stars, martini hawks, mould kites, buzzards, cormorants, ringtails, iron eagles, ospreys, woodwalls, jays, ravens, kites, fruit kingfisher, bullfinch, or any other bird that eats fruit, fox, greys, fitchews, weasels, stoats, fairbaids or wildcat, otter, hedgehog, rats and mice. That's virtually everything we'd love to see in the countryside today. The only one you might not recognise there is choughs, which are jackdaws essentially, and they obviously didn't like the harriers. But you see, most of those birds aren't going to be pestering anything in the way of crops, but this is what they think. Hedgehog, rats and mice, we'll look at those in a second. So basically, here's an entry in the Little Barrington's Church Wardens accounts for 1771, and it shows money paid for urchins, which is hedgehogs, and then sparrows and sparrows' eggs. And the hedgehogs come down, third line down, for 2 urchins, 8p. And then you get 3.5 dozen sparrows there, and 3.5 dozen sparrows' eggs, and then another line, 3 urchins and 16 sparrows. Hedgehogs worth about 8p, about £2.91 today. How terrifying is that? 3.5 dozen sparrows, about 42 birds, 7p, £2.50. These are the monies that were paid out. Cost more to wash the church's surpluses in all these occasions. So I find these records truly abhorrent and truly saddening. Sadly, we have lots here in the archives. This is from the parish of Cowley for 1777, and this money is for fishers, which are kingfishers and foxes. And you see, paid for 2 fishers, third entry down. Basically, it's a penny. Basically, sparrows listed further down the page. There's lots of them on this one. Sparrows were heavily targeted as they were deemed a pest on crops and damaged buildings, especially thatched ones. And it's been estimated between 1700 and 1930, about 100 million sparrows were killed. It was still legal to catch and kill them up to 2005, which is horrific. And this is partly why sparrows are so rare, really, today. This is one for the Church Wardens accounts of Coley. It's got the usual payments for sparrows in there, but it also records payments for 2 fitchers or polecats. Again, they were worth 4 pence each. So 8p for 2, £1.28 for a polecat today. Terrible, isn't it? And this one is a very sad photo, I think, taken from a photograph album of photographs of Bishop's Cleeve Woodmancote, probably taken at Manor Farm, Alston, which is between Teddington and Toddington in the 1900s. Shows obviously a badger that's been caught and killed and hung up there. Badgers were hated as they were thought to steal chickens, kill young lambs, take eggs from birds' nests, and their sets could also undermine the edges of fields, so destroy crops basically. Consequently, badgers were quite valued. They were worth a shilling, which is about £4 today at this date. And killing badgers was still legal in Britain until the 1992 Protection of Badgers Act. Although, of course, if you're the government, you could just get around this by saying, sorry, mate, that badger's coughing. Let's kill it. It's got TB. Gamekeepers are employed by landowner or state to prevent poaching, to rear and release game birds, eradicate pests, i.e. everything, and control predators, i.e. everything. They also allegedly manage habitats to suit game and to monitor the health of the game. That's a bit lacking. But the Act for the Better Preservation of Game in 1707 stated that one gamekeeper could be appointed per manor and that every deputation would have to be registered with the clerk of the police. And we've got quite a few of these. It's an application or a license for the gamekeeper. One of the things about it is it usually had to be written by the lord of the manor. So this is where you get all those rich dukes having to write a page of notes, basically for the gamekeepers or for all the gamekeepers they had, and appoint it with the Court of Sessions. And in addition to this, they were charged £2, 2 shilling a year, and a 10 shillings 6pence cost of the gamekeeper's license. So, they're quite good. I would say we've got lots of these. And again, if you're interested or you had an ancestor to gamekeeper, odds are we've probably got a sort of certificate saying or pointing him. So brings us all to what we call the agricultural revolution, or the evolution is a better one. And the first one's really the model, what they call the model farms. And despite the sort of social implications, enclosure we know did bring new investment and new improvements into farming. And this is what I say gradually came to be known as agricultural revolution. And really amongst these, the most notable things we see today are the Victorian model farms or example farms. So these were this is an example farm at Cromwell, and the bottom one is the Whitfield example farm in Fowlfield. And the idea behind these farms was that agriculturally knowledgeable landowners could show their less fortunate and more, how should we say it, stupid neighbours and their tenants the way to increase the income and crop yields through purpose-built farm buildings, new technology and improved farming methods. So now, basically, what they're saying is, well, you don't need all these little buildings on your farm. You need like a cow shed, you need a pig shed, you need a barn to store things. This is all you need. And and if you look on the OS maps, especially on Know Your Place, for example, you'll find quite a few of these example farms. Many of them still survive today, but they've got a lot more buildings on, has to be said. The second stage in this revolution, mechanisation. And this is a lovely picture, comes via the Wilson Museum in Cheltenham, and it shows haymaking at Dixton Manor, Alderton. It's a great one. It's hard to see. It's up there, so I thank them for using these pictures. I've gone over, had a good look at this picture, and there are 130 people working in just this one field collecting the hay. You can see the line of scythemen there, okay, and then there's people making stooks of hay to try and dry it. But what I do like is if I look at bottom right, they've got entertainment. They're the Morris men. They're heading off to the pub. They've had enough work, is what Morris men normally do, isn't it? And I say that as an ex-man myself. So you've got this after this enclosure and the model farms, mechanization was critical to improving the nation's agriculture. You got horse-drawn mowers replaced the scythesmen, seed drills replaced broadcasting, mechanical threshing machines made farms more efficient, all because they required fewer men, which made the farm more efficient and be able to grow better crops. And the two biggest, most labour-intensive, important times of the farming year, haymaking and harvest time, revolutionised by mechanisation. Quick look at haymaking. So here you got the introduction of horse-drawn mowing machines. So instead of that 130 people needed to make a field of hay, a farmer could do it with a handful of men and a few horses. This is this lovely view of Copsgrove Farm in Bisley. And you can see some things were the same. The gentleman on the right-hand side is holding a wooden hay rake. Not quite sure what the frame behind him, the other man, is. I've looked at that, not quite sure what it is. But you can see instead of the 130 people, you can do this field with basically 5 men and a dog. And by World War One, static mechanical hay balers had been produced, which speeded up the haymaking process. And here's a Ruston mechanical baler being driven by a traction engine in Bisley in 1917. 5 of the 9 men visible in this one are soldiers, and we tend to forget that in World War One, haymaking was vital to the war effort. And I think the figures about 40% of all cargoes crossing from England to the continent were hay for the horses. Of course, horses were vital for the army. They were drawing all the supplies, taking all the artillery. So the hay crop was absolutely vital. And this is one of the reasons they released soldiers to help with it, because they had to get that hay harvest in to feed the animals abroad. Of course, mechanical balers soon made immobile versions that were towed behind either horses or, in this example, tractors. Again, a lovely picture comes to the 1940s, basically, of a mechanical baler being towed behind a tractor, and it's great. Looks like it's haymaking on that one. Harvest time. So after haymaking, harvest was the single most important time of the year for farming. And this photograph, lovely old photograph, shows what was needed. Decent dry weather, lots of hands, and a dog if you lived there in the front there. So you're getting this, but you see how labour intensive this is. These are probably only a quarter of the men that were involved on this farm to harvest. And basically what they're doing is sticks of corn here are being loaded up onto a wagon, which is again going to be drawn into the farm to be threshed. So harvest time was a real case of all hands to the pumps. As late as the 1970s, farmers, family and friends would often visit the farm to help. I used to go up to my uncle's farm at Dowdeswell at haymaking and harvest time. And there's lovely pictures here. This is Mrs. Watkins and her daughter Emmy collecting corn to make stooks in Forthampton. There's also a notorious thing called gleaning, where once the farmer had got all the hay, off the wheat and corn off his field, the poor people would be allowed on the fields to sort of scavenge what they could. And again, this is a lovely picture of a wagon here being loaded with the stooks of corn in Callowell strain. This is quite late. This is from the 1920s and 1930s, so it's still being done by hand then. And I love the fact the horse there, you can see him, he's snaffled a few pieces of corn to munch there. However, the threshing machines, these images show the threshing machine of W.S. Browning and Sons of Stonehouse in operation. Wonderful set of photographs. Powered by steam, the threshing machines revolutionised the harvest. You'd put sticks of corn fed into the thresher. This separated the grain from the stalks and the husks, let the grain fall out of one side to be bagged, while the straw itself was carried through the machine and dumped at the top of the end of it, where it could then be put onto a rick or into a barn. And, basically they heralded the start of what we now know is the very busy agricultural contracting business. It's such a big business today, but also the swing riots. The swing riots were where the sort of basically farm labourers were getting fed up of all this new mechanisation and they were breaking up machines. Very strong in Wiltshire and Gloucestershire. And again, there's lots of separate information you can find on the swing riots. Most interesting period. But like 1950s, though, modern farmers were harvesting using combine harvesters, essentially self-propelled threshing machines. And here's a very nice looking Massey Ferguson F400 combine empty and drained into a trailer, coincidentally towed by a Massey Ferguson 135 tractor. Obviously, this farmer liked the Masseys. They basically, if you know Massey Fergusons, these vehicles have been bright red. And I remember my uncle at the Dowdeswell farm harvesting like this back in the 60s and 70s. What was great is he hated the idea of hurting any animals. So he would actually be standing up in his seat, shouting and hollering to scare all the animals ahead of the combine. And you'd see deer, fawns, rabbits, birds running out in front of it. It was a great time. So other crops grown, we've got some information on these: flax, oats, barley, turnips, rape and market garden crops, peas, beans and sprouts were all quite commonly grown. World War II, of course, many grass fields were ploughed up and turned over to crops. They realised that getting a cow to eat grass to make milk and make beef was a very inefficient way of feeding the country. So the best thing is to get rid of the cows and just grow things like wheat and in the Vale, especially potatoes. And this is a lovely photograph of women's land army girls who've just finished harvesting the 1943 potato crop at Slingbridge. A massive crop of potatoes there. Even so, some of these, they were growing stuff where it wasn't always suitable, but it was a crop coming in. Looking at hedging, after the enclosure, the art of dividing up the countryside and the art of hedging became vital, essentially. It was a seasonal job using weapons such as billocks, axes, slashers. You also needed quite good stout clothing, leather aprons and leather gauntlets usually. But the idea is you make a solid livestock-proof fence, which promoted hedge growth as well. And lovely note here from James Agg Hewlett's estate in Cheltenham. You can see their hedges laid on the lug. Also below it is transplanted with ditch. Usually when they actually laid a hedge, one side would have a ditch. Basically, this was to definitely prevent large animals from trying to break through. For example, a bull sniffing a heifer in heat on the other side of the hedge would still have a hard job getting through them. And today, hedgerows, of course, define our land, our countryside. They're vitally important for wildlife as a refuge, as they find a source of food for them, and as corridors from which they can move through the landscape. Sadly, though, today, most hedges are chain flailed, which is a dreadful thing to do to a hedge. And you'll notice lots of hedges that have been chain flailed. They look very square and rectangular, but look at the base and there are gaps in them, which means they don't hold stock anymore. So basically, if you have a chain flailed hedge, after about 4 or 5 years, you're going to have to put a modern wire fence behind it. So, they're not as good. Hedging is making a bit of a comeback. Trouble is, it's quite a labour-intensive job and it's quite expensive today. Quick mention of the corn laws. They were introduced in 1815, although some had been a bit earlier, basically to protect cereal producers from imports. This was after the Napoleonic Wars, when there was a bit of a tough stuff anyway. But this led to a lot of hostility between the cereal producers, i.e. mainly upper class landowners, and the new industrialists who were busy making things in the towns and cities. And of course, the landowners wanted grain prices kept high to boost their profits and political power associated with land ownership. But the price of high stuff led to unrest and riots. And this is a very famous picture of the Bath Corn Law riots of 1830, I think it was. Conversely, the industrialists wanted grain prices low because this means they didn't have to pay their workers as much money and they could make more profit. And this is a lovely petition from Dursley wanting the existing corn laws prior to 1815 to remain in place. And the previous ones prior to 1815 were quite lax, and they weren't they only actually activated if the price of corn went so high. But of course, as I said, the high price kept bread price high, so industrialists had to pay the workers high wages that could not afford to eat. A massive battle going on. Look at the newspapers of this day, such as the Journal and even the Citizen, and basically you'll find pages and pages going on about the corn laws, poor laws. Corn laws even get me teeth in. But in the end, the industrialists won the battle. In 1846, the corn laws were repealed, which made grain react to market prices, made it a lot cheaper so people could feed themselves. Tractors, so internal combustion tractors evolved from traction engines. They begin to appear in the early 1900s, various designs. Their rolling farmer was fixed in World War I when the wartime labour shortage of men and horses, because so many horses had been adopted abroad, triggered a rapid rise in demand for mechanisation and vehicles. And we have the lovely thing, the County War Agricultural, the War Ag, requisitioned tractors all over the place, and they created a pool for their use. And this is reflected in some of the records we have, notably the Cultivations Committee Machinery section. They love their little titles and parchments, didn't they? And you can see here, this is the machinery section. Look at the amount of tractors. So they had basically 73 tractors in commission. They worked 580 hours. Some were stopped for weather, some were stopped to repairs. You could basically hire a tractor or order it in. You were allowed to have it for like a day or 2 days, then it had to go back. So rather like the horses, but they'd had a horse section as well, which did the same sort of thing. But the horses weren't as efficient, weren't as quick as the tractors. And of course, once the tractors had basically started in World War One, they started to take over completely. Looking at some of the livestock now, I love this Victorian picture. It's from an agricultural diary we have, and I love the fact that it's the very small cow or it's a very big sheep. I'm not sure which way round it is, but they look good anyway. So look at the livestock. This is an example of some of the records we have. This is a lovely memo book from Thomas Cother of Longford, records payments for various animals on his farm. Not going to go through all of them, but it includes 3 oxen, for which he paid £23. Equivalent of about 2,300 today. 14 pigs, 11 shillings each. 21 sheep for £12, 17 shillings and sixpence. And I've looked through this. The price of a cow and a calf ranges from £4 2 shillings to £5 12 shillings and sixpence. So about 420 to nearly £600 today. And as a comparison, today the average price, it fluctuates enormously. There's about £350 for a cow, £334 for an ox, £84 for a pig, and about £80 for a sheep. So amazing variations here. Cattle were very popular in the Vale of Gloucester originally, but later spread up into the Cotswolds. Most were bred for milking. This lovely picture shows milking time at Sydenham Farm. I think these pictures are often posed because you're going to try and milk in a byre if you can. It's because the cow can't walk away basically, but they are nice. And this is another one, Gloucester cow being milked in a farmyard while another takes her turn and ready and waiting. And cows are normally quite happy to be milked. They just know there's food involved, so they just be eating away, and you can milk them quite happily. They can, of course, be recalcitrant beasts, and this is a lovely picture. Shows a World War II land girl obviously trying to persuade her charge to do something. She's got down to the point, come on, you daft animal, I want you to walk this way. And you can look, I love it, you can look at the cow's expression just by the ears, and you can thinking, I'm not convinced, you're going to have to tell me some more. Is there food involved? I love that photograph. And I love this one, September 1961, utter disbelief. Get it? Utter disbelief. That's a comedy act for you. In the county dairy farming communities, a Frisian cow gave birth to triplets, a 1 in 100,000 chance, and the citizen was there to record it. Excuse me. Doesn't happen very often. Probably more often than you think, but the twins, yeah, quite common, but triplets very, very rare. Gloucester cattle. So the Gloucester cow is one of the rarest native breeds in the UK. We know it originated in the Severn Vale sometime in the 13th century, but we can't be precise on it. They are beautiful, absolutely beautiful animals. Black-brown bodies with a black head and black legs. They have this white stripe that runs down the back, through the tail, down over the udder into the belly. You can't mistake them for anything else. And they are a true all-purpose breed. Valued for their milk. Where do we get our single and double Gloucester cheese from? Their beef, and also they provide a strong draft auction. And if that wasn't enough, of course, we've got to thank Blossom, the Gloucester cow, who saved the world from smallpox. This is where Jenner got his first smallpox vaccine from. So they are wonderful beasts, really are. And of course, where the cattle are, we have our cheese making. So this is a lovely photograph of cheese making at Old Court Farm, Lower Stone, taken in 1973 by P. Turner. And it shows the lady using the curd breaker, and on the curd turbine in the background, you can see a cheese press and some various cheese molds there as well. So again, traditionally, absolutely fabulous single Gloucester and double Gloucester cheeses were, of course, only made with the milk of the Gloucester cattle. And again, these cheeses have survived. They are still available today. And if you see them at Stroud Market or anywhere, you'd be most advised to buy yourself, a couple of pounds worth. The single Gloucester is gorgeous. That was tended to be eaten in the county because it didn't keep for very long, so it was eaten locally. Double Gloucester was a harder cheese, and that could be exported, so that's why that's more famous. Very few people relatively heard of Gloucester, single Gloucester cheese, but it's delicious. But as well as those two traditional cheeses, lots of others were made. This is a page from the volume of the Hyatt and Dickinson Family Archive. It's a volume dedicated to preserving fruit and making cheese, as well as making rennet. And this particular cheese, we think it was the work of Sarah Hunt, who was a wife of Dr. Adams of Oxford, written in 1740. And this cheese was pressed in a cheesecloth, wrapped in cloth then, and this cloth was changed every day for a month. And many of the cheeses had specific months and seasons that they could be made. And this is an example. We note at the bottom there, this says, this cheese must not be made in June or July, for it will be maggoty if it is made in hot weather. Presumably, you make it in chilly April and May and September, it will be fine. But this book, I love this book. It's got so many cheese recipes on it, and to the untrained eye, they all look often the same, but they're not. And there are some quite rare cheeses in this one, but time precludes us looking at it. Oxen and male cattle being castrated makes them much docile and much safer to work with. They used to be yoked in pairs or multiple pairs, and they're used for ploughing, harrowing, pulling carts, hauling wagons, and even riding. Lots of people used to ride the oxen. And I love this photo down here. This is taken on the Bathurst estate in 1910. That shows a man and a boy taking a break from harrowing. But this would have been a scene that you could have seen in Gloucestershire medieval times onwards. And one of the things we work on oxen is tradition to call the near side, the left-hand ox, by a single syllable name, and the offside one a longer one, double syllable usually. So you, for example, I'll put there lark and linnet, quick and nimble, pert and lively, which is probably everything. It doesn't apply to an ox, but it's a great photograph nonetheless. So cattle could be dangerous. This burial register from Kempsford records William Howard, aged 13, and in the note there in the margin, the vicar's put killed by Mrs. Day's bull. Bulls can be, quite sort of ornery animals, and you have to be wary when you're around them. This is a very sad, but I have to say slightly amusing inquest, coroner's inquest into Ada Self, who died in 1872 in the parish of St George, Bristol. And the nub of the thing is that the said Ada Self, being naturally weak and delicate and timid, was frightened by certain cows passing in the street, and was then and there seized with convulsions from the effect of which fright and convulsions the said Ada Self there, and then died. Very sad, but I mean, dying by cows, just by seeing them. Bless her. Some pigs. I love this photograph. It shows a woman herding pigs in the high street, Chipping Camden, just by the Live and Let Live Inn. And if you follow our Facebook channel, this was one of the pictures today. I didn't realize this, but it was the Where Is It Wednesday. But it's likely these pigs have been taken to market, but looking at the way they're scattered all over the place, you wonder what chaos they're going to be causing on the way through to market. Pigs are bred purely for food, and the coronation of George V in June 1911, the perfect occasion for a hog roast at Bisley. Quite a small one. I think that they used the biggest pig they had there, to be honest. And of course, we have our lovely old spot pig, the orchard pig or the cottager's pig. And again, these seem to originate in the Vale of Gloucester sometime in the sort of 1300s, 1400s. They are the oldest pedigree pig breed in the world. And when the Gloucester Old Spot Breed Society was formed in 1913, they were called Old Spot simply because they'd been around for as long as anyone could remember. So there's no other reason than that. But interestingly, a gentleman called Johnny Douglas of Kingswood, more famous for making motorbikes, his second passion were old spot pigs. This is a picture of his champion sow taken around 1920, which is a nice one. And interestingly, what I found very interesting, the first pedigree records of the old spots only start in 1885. It's far later than those of cattle, sheep, and horses, primarily because the pig had always been deemed a peasant's animal, and therefore, as a scavenger, it was never very highly regarded by any of the sort of what they call the proper farmers. So I found that very interesting. Sheep, usually described by sheep farmers as animals looking for new ways to die. Sheep have been in Gloucester since the Iron Age and probably before. And despite numbers falling from the medieval peak, there's still around 260,000 sheep in the county. And there's some prize rams there on the left, and there's obviously four, is it quadruplets there, and the farm daughters. They've all survived, which is great. Cotswold sheep, as I mentioned earlier, probably a cross between Iron Age breeds, like a Soay sheep, and a Roman long wool breed. Their wool was known as the Golden Fleece, owing to its rich lustre, and of course it was a big export in the Middle Ages. And it played a key role in the development of many Cotswold towns, villages, but also the finances of the nation. And amazingly, flocks of over 6,000 sheep were now common. But times have changed, and sadly, the Cotswold sheep are now classed as a rare breed. This is one we probably haven't heard of, the Ryland sheep. They're a white-faced, no-horns, smallish sort of dual-purpose sheep. Still quite popular, but they seem to have originated in West Gloucestershire, Herefordshire area, with the monks of Leominster playing a leading role. And their fleeces became a sort of a staple, a standard by which other fleeces were judged. And they were called Ryland simply because they grazed mostly on rye pastures. So again, go right back to the early medieval, some things are quite simple. Of course, the Forest Dean, infamous for its free roaming sheep. This dates back to a charter of 1217, allowing freeborn foresters the right to collect wood for fuel and graze livestock. Sheep badgers is the local nickname. There's about 48 or 50 commoners left who still keep sheep. The sheep are haunted. It doesn't mean they're ghostly. This means they are settled in what they call a heft, a small local area, and they rarely stray, although some do have a real good penchant, and they used to any for the centre of some of the forest towns. Generally, if they are hefted properly, they don't need to be fenced in, and the lambs learn their heft and their haunt from the mothers. So here you have the continuity of sheep is therefore extremely important in the forest. And if you like the Forest Dean sheep, they have their own media presence. Kevin Dave, the Roadsiders, find on Facebook in the Forest Dean Rye Valley Review, and they are very, very amusing little cartoons. We look at chickens, most common form of poultry kept. Most farms and cottages had some of some sort. This is a man feeding his chickens outside a pub. Basically, they can be kept in a run, can be fed on scrap and mix. And again, it's the sort of thing that the kids would have to do. That was their job, feeding the chicks in the day. And of course, with chickens, you always got eggs. And of course, every now and then you're going to get an old chicken, which means you get an occasional roast, which everybody really enjoys. Geese feature here as rental payments, usually at Christmas, quarter session indictments for theft and place names. This is a very typical example. It's a copy for a message and appurtenances, i.e. property. And here's the mouthful called Ties the Reet ap Harrell ap Morris in Montgomeryshire. We've got it because it's a solicitor's collection. Calls for a rent of £9 a year, plus a fat goose and a couple of capons at the Nativity. But of course, geese also appear in non-agricultural settings, village ponds, parks, and other enclosures and towns. And this is an example of some looking at some geese in a town somewhere. Turkeys, love this photograph. A lady feeding turkeys at Charonworth Chase Farm, Charonworth in the north of the county. By the 1900s, turkeys had overtaken geese as the main Christmas fare, and lots of farmers began raising and selling turkeys as they were actually easier to keep than geese, and they grew larger, so you could make more money from them. And the reason for that was whereas geese like to be kept outside on grazing, turkeys could be kept in barns and just let out to roam around a farmyard picking up insects and things, so they're a lot easier to manage. Wouldn't be farming without looking at horses, and obviously for years horses are the prime stock animal used for farm work. Like oxen, they're used for ploughing, harrowing, mowing, reaping, and general transport. Picture top left is Ted. He worked on a farm in Lake Hampton, basically, and he'd retired, and on his 90th birthday he came back to see the horses he used to look after. Well, that lovely photo. And then bottom left is a lady, it's a vicar's daughter doing a bit in World War One ploughing where are the men. Orchards, But Gloucester on both sides of Severn, prime areas for orchards, a lovely orchard plant from an orchard book we have. And although many eating apples were grown, by far the bulk of apple growing was directed towards cider apples. And again, this lovely poster from Dunny Farm, Minsterworth at Bruton Knowles, the 5,000 gallons of cider and perry. Just think how many trees and how many apples that involves. It's an awful lot there. Plant nurseries, many exist around the country. One of the largest was John Jeffries of Cirencester. This picture taken at Siddington shows a large conifer tree being moved on what's a Barron's tree transporter. This was built by a noted horticulturalist, and it revolutionised the movement of mature trees. Today, there's just one of these machines surviving, but it's okay because it's actually kept at RHS Kew Gardens in working order, because they do sometimes move their trees around. And market gardens and nurseries, they grew fruits, vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, ornamental plants for the grocery trade, or more recently private residents. In Gloucester, the largest market garden was Wheeler's, which is now the Heritage Hub here. They were very, very famous and sold trees to the Queen, Victoria, all sorts. And another famous one, gone now, Hurrens of Churchdown, people might remember it, opened in 46 and didn't close until 2010. This is the site at Churchdown, which is now where the Tesco's Churchdown is. I mentioned John Jeffries earlier on. They had nurseries in Cirencester, Somerford, Keynes and Siddington, traded until 1980. Every year they produced new seed catalogues. In 1939, their prize plant was the Cotswold Pixie Sprout. Again, made to go alongside their Cotswold Queen cabbage and their Victory onion in 1939 prior to war. I would love to know whether any of these varieties survive today. So if you've grown sprouts and you happen to have a Cotswold Pixie, please do let us know. We'd love to taste it. Forestry, so we get the idea of forests are just there, but they're not. Woodlands and forests are cash crops a bit over a long period, and they were bought and sold as land were. So this is a lovely picture of the Hanger and Conygar woods in West Kinton, Wiltshire, owned by the Codringtons. Many woods are also worked as coppice woodland, so basically this provided a regular income while the larger trees grew. So the coppicing you'd coppice usually hazel, and so you cut it down, you get lots of lovely stakes and stuff for wattle and daub, etc., making fencing, and then 7 to 21 years later you can do it again, and you'd move around the woodland in a compartment. We look at allotments. Allotments Act in 1890 required the urban and rural district councils to provide allotments because they'd realised with more people growing in towns without gardens, they were unable to grow their own food. So allotments, one of the rules was they had to be let at the same rates as local farmland, so they couldn't make a profit out of them as such. I did a bit of work on this. There are about 330 allotment plots in the UK today. In Gloucestershire, there are 92 allotment sites with about 1,610 plots across the county. So Gloucestershire City's got the biggest with just over 1,100, followed by South Gloss 350, Stroud 200. Surprisingly, Tewkesbury's only got 30, but it's more countryside there. And coming towards the end of the talk, so basically, somebody mentioned the other day, why are so few farmers called farmer? You think it'd be natural, Farmer Giles, Farmer John, that sort of thing. But the explanation is quite simple. The name farmer comes from Middle English firma, which comes from the French fermier, which means a person who collects tithes and taxes on the land. So basically, a person owning a land farm without working practically on it would usually be known as a lord, a laird, or a yeoman, which are freeholders. But you have, of course, lovely surnames, practical roles in farming: shepherd, cowman, ploughman, ackerman, bannister, I didn't know that one, basket maker, burgher, shepherd, marshal, horseman, stoddard, shearer, mather. General workers on the land, surnames tenant, grange, cotter, and clerical roles on farms or manors, surnames bailey, steward, and reeve. I love these two. These are boys. These are up at the upper mop fair, and presumably they've been hired, and they're now drowning their sorrows, as it were. And sort of almost at the end, I can't mention farming without talking about lovely Eric Freeman. Sadly died last year, but before he did, he'd made this video. Somebody recorded him talking about his early farm days in the Newark area, and we've got a copy here at the archives. It's also available at several local libraries, Gloucestershire libraries, to look at. Or you can buy it. And if you've got any interest in farming in the countryside, you will not regret spending a tenner on this DVD. It's absolutely fantastic. So, he was a lovely, lovely man. Sadly, very, very sadly missed. Couple of photos left. The best things about drain bales or haymaking harvest times, crib time. You can't beat sitting down within the hay or the straw, and the farmers' wives and the girls bringing up bottles of food and pop and all sorts of stuff. Great fun. We got this lovely picture here. And then F.W. Harvey, greatest forest poet. Lovely poem here. I will go back to Gloucestershire, to the spot where I was born, to talk at eve with men and women and song the roads at morn. And I'll sing as I tramp by dusty hedges or drink my ale in the shade, how Gloucestershire is the finest home that the Lord God ever made. I love that poem. Got the little pictures here. I like this one. Where's a milkmaid when you need one? And again, milking a cow. And obviously, this brings us to the end of the talk. So our next Saturday event is on Saturday, the 5th of April. So it's not this Saturday, it's Saturday after. It's to do with the Archives Green Pledge Project team, entitled The Price of Food. There are two good talks, one about the Green Pledge Project itself and one from the Farm and Wildlife Advisory Group, James Lunt, on how archives can aid farming. There will also be our Archives bee stall being evidence, so you can have a look at our local bees we have here. We've got 3 hives here. Don't think there's going to be a honey on sale. It's not the right time of year for it, and as usual there will be a display of farming related documents and archives and photographs. Plus we've got the Family History Society are on hand to find your agricultural roots. And our final plug, our next Secrets Revealed talk is Twos and Blues on the 23rd of April, when we're looking at Gloucestershire's emergency services. And on that note, Gemma, I'll hand back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. That was really interesting. We do have a couple of comments and questions. So first of all, we've been asked, did the enclosure process involve a lot of hedge planting?
It did afterwards, yes. Because prior to this, you'd get hedges and fences around the village, in the village, outside, all open field agriculture. Very, very few hedges or fences around. Of course, once enclosure kicked in, everybody said, "Well, this is my land now. I want to fence it in." And then subsequently, they would subdivide the great fields into smaller ones. So yes, it really kicked off that process.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Tony has asked, said, still stuck on trying to identify an iron eagle. Tony, I do apologise. I just read this and I was just wondering what bit of the talk it was referring to. John, do you know?
Yeah, it was. So it was on the Elizabeth's Act of species considered to be vermin. I think the iron eagle is probably the white-tailed sea eagle, but we're not sure about that. If you remember that list, they have various things like chuffs for jackdaws and things, stars or starlings. So they tend to be very loose in their identification of these various, especially the various sort of raptors and eagles. So I'm pretty sure it was a white-tailed sea eagle. It might have been a golden eagle, but I think the white-tailed sea eagle is more common. It would have been more common in these areas.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, John. Sue commented that her ancestors were the poachers near Whittington. I have a newspaper cutting. She has a newspaper cutting of the court case, which is quite interesting.
That's it. That's a whole different subject. There's the poaching and the poachers v gamekeepers. It's another great subject. Maybe we'll look at it in the future, because of course we've got our famous Berkeley poaching case here, where the two chaps were they actually executed or were they transported for poaching? But so that's probably a talk in the future, I think.
Absolutely, very interesting. Okay, and then we've also had a question from Siono, sorry, who said the info pics very interesting, and will they be getting a copy of the presentation? Which I think I could probably answer to say, unfortunately, not. Apart from anything, it would be enormous, as you can imagine, with all the photographs. However, you will get a link to the recording of this, so you can watch it back. We do obviously have the references for the majority of the documents are here at the archives, so you can come and see them. John, did you want to add to this?
Yes, we'd also, of course, what we normally do, we didn't do it last month because it didn't work, but we also usually put up a little online exhibition of this. So it won't be all the images in there, but it'll be most of the ones that are images rather than other people. So that will basically go online. When I've written it, I normally finished it by now. I haven't started it yet, so you're looking for a week or so, I think. But have a look for that. It will be online.
Brilliant. That's great, John, and really worth looking at. For any of you sort of interested in find the images particularly interesting that we use in these talks, we do have these online exhibitions which are fantastic. If you just want to have a look over, all the kind of the highlights. We've also got Andrew James said his great grandfather had a cow die as a result of being bitten by an adder, and it was reported in the Gloucestershire newspaper of the day.
Yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. And it's I mean, we've got a lot of adders around here. Usually they won't disturb you, but you do come across them in surprising places. I remember walking my dog in the forest once in the pine woods, and I watched ahead and I'm thinking, what's he looking at? And he was jumping back, and there was this little adder. It was only about a sort of foot long, and I thought, okay, I'll move him off the footpath. So I got a sort of a 3-foot stick, started to move him, and he sort of jumped at me, and he easily came up 3/4 of the way of the stick. So I thought, okay, I'll just leave him there. We walked around it.
Very sensible. We've had a reminder from Katie, who does all our techie stuff, just to say again that the link will be sent out to you for this video, but also just a reminder that all previous talks are also there, and they're under the Heritage Hub, so if you ever want to look at those. Andrew also said relatives on his grandfather's side are called Farmer Slatter from Alderton. Some relatives emigrated to Australia, and the name Farmer is listed amongst family names out there.
Very interesting, yeah. Excellent.
Brilliant. Liz has said, absolutely brilliant talk. Thank you very much, Liz. I would love to hear a talk on poachers and gamekeepers if you decide to do one. Yeah, absolutely. And just a few thank yous. It's interesting to hear about the Enclosures Act, people being denied access to the land. Are you currently pulling together documents relating to right to roam for future reference?
No, we're not, but we've got a lot of we've got the definitive maps and the footpath maps here. And of course, once the public rights of way people have redone them to meet the new legislation, they'll be stored here as well. So we will have stuff on that eventually here. But we've got the sort of the original 1976 Act, I think, stuff here.
Brilliant, thank you. A couple more thank yous. And Sandy also said, not able to find the Prosper production. Could you please repeat the name?
Yes, the second. It's Prospero Productions. Where am I? Just second. So it's Prospero Productions Limited. And the name of the DVD is Eric Freeman, A Legend in These Parts. I have got an email. I don't know how current it is, I must admit. So it's Prospero, Prospero, at Orpheus Mail, all one word, which is ORPHEUS Mail, MAIL.co.uk. So Brilliant. Try that. If not, it's in the libraries. I think it was on Amazon as well. On the even eBay. I think I found a copy on eBay a while ago, so that's worth looking for as well.
Brilliant. And Liz has actually just put up a link to that on YouTube. So thank you very much, Liz. I think that brings us sort of to the end. Thank you so much for all your questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you.
We really do appreciate that. So thank you everybody for coming along today. We look forward to seeing you next time. As always, thank you so much to John for all the hard work and amazing detail that you put into these talks. We really do appreciate it. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Okay, folks, cheerio. Take care.